countries who need those medicines still cannot access them. We spoke to Jayasree Iyer, the CEO of Access to Medicine Foundation, on this and more earlier.
Generic and brand name medicines are actually identical when it comes to the active pharmaceutical ingredients that they have inside them. The product will be slightly different in color, shape, or markings and the packaging. And brand name drugs are usually available in the market first. They're considered the first version of a drug to be sold within a company. And it's typically sold by the manufacturer that does the research and develop the drug and commercialized it in the market itself. One of the biggest difference between generic medicine and brand name drugs is the cost, because generic drugs are generally less expensive than brand name competitors itself. So when you asked about the availability, despite their comparatively cheaper price, generic and biosimilar medicines are still unaffordable to many. Although they're priced lower, they can still be unaffordable as many people living in low and middle income countries pay out of pocket for health products and services. And you know, at the end, the availability of also quality assured essential medicines are also limited in low and middle income countries. We see in our research that if the originator drug isn't available, companies hesitate to register their drugs there. There's severe quality issues because there are many manufacturers that make medicines, but they also take shortcuts and then they're not quality assured. And products obviously don't reach the most vulnerable and underserved populations in low and middle income countries in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, you've just touched on why generic and biosimilar products are still out of reach for many patients within the lower middle income countries. Just when you look at expanding access, why are generic medicines, they are indeed crucial to expanding access to medicines, but what can be done to bridge these gaps?
I think there's a lot that can be done to bridge these gaps itself. I think firstly, there's a lot that the industry themselves can do. So I can allude to that in a bit. Companies can expand product registration in low and middle income countries so that more products are available in countries itself from their portfolio. They can make their access strategies more comprehensive in that sense, focusing on affordability so that the most vulnerable populations around the world are able to access treatments. So they're not necessarily only relying on the tender-based approaches to sell their medicines. They can participate in public sector programs. They can look at specific needs in non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and asthma, and also engage directly with private sector, so some of the major hospitals, to ensure medicines are accessible and affordable. Companies can also implement strategies to ensure that the products are actually consistently available, because one of the biggest issues is you don't have the products on the shelf long term, right? So there's lots of stockouts and shortages. And lastly, I think companies can invest in adapting products, because a lot of times products are made in the market and brought into the market, but they're not necessarily suitable to be used for example, children, or they're not suitable to be used in temperatures when you have rising temperatures, and it can need storage in a refrigerator. So adapting a product to make it more easily stored, more easily used by different populations is another way that companies can invest and bridge some of these gaps.
Yeah, I mean, it has been more evident than ever, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, the current gaps that we have here on the African continent. When you look at the less developed pharmaceutical industry as well as the manufacturing industry at large, just from where you sit, how crucial is it to just develop and just put, whether it's the public as well as the private sector as well as all stakeholders coming together to just focus on this element to just bridge these gaps?
I think the role that the generic industry and generic medicine plays has been largely underestimated in the global landscape itself, right? So there's a natural assumption that because a product is generically available, it will be cheaper, and by nature, because it's cheaper, it's going to be available. I think right now we've seen during the COVID pandemic, but also, you know, it's just a chronic issue that's been spanning decades. Their products are just not available in resource-limited settings. They're not available at the health systems. They're not available in the hospitals, but they're also not available for health practitioners who are working in communities and in the fields itself. So you really need to think about what needs to happen. And the World Health Organization has already identified some of the key products that need to be there in even a basic health system. So there's a lot that can be done. I think awareness of the generic medicines, awareness of how the industry produces them, what is being produced, and really a policy shift and more engagement on this issue can really help solve and bridge some of these gaps itself.
Yeah, and what were the key findings from the September report, and as well as how can African policymakers, healthcare providers, and pharmaceutical companies really use the insights and recommendations from this report?
So the key findings of the reports are, we studied 5 companies that are assessed in this report. So these are Cipla, Hikma, Sun Pharma, Teva, and Viatris. So they're large multinational companies. They all have an existing regulatory reach in low and middle income countries. And it's collectively quite a broad reach. But what we found is that an analysis of a subset of a number of essential medicines that we studied reveals that there's a number of access gaps. So we found that companies are using access strategies to expand access to their products to reach different segments of the population, but the efforts fall short for some of the poorest populations living in the world. And that's where as I earlier mentioned, relying on the tender system alone doesn't necessarily guarantee that people are getting access to their products itself. Among the 5 companies, a handful of initiatives have been there to kind of improve local manufacturing capacity in low and middle income countries, including in the African continent itself, and technology transfer so that local companies can make these drugs and, you have better local availability in the continent, in the subcontinent itself. But at the end, there's a lot more efforts that need to be done to safeguard that availability of the products itself. I think lastly, the report highlights 9 examples of research and development products that are being adapted to be better used in resource-limited settings, where companies are tailoring these products to the needs of people. So specific adaptation for children, products adapted so that they don't require refrigeration, formulations that improve adherence so that children are able to take these drugs and they come back and they take the medicines over time itself. So there's a number of findings that basically point towards the opportunity that all these companies need to do more. And in order for the companies to do more, we need policymakers, healthcare providers, pharmaceutical companies to work together on improving the system. In all 5 of these companies that we measure, they all have a sales presence in Africa. And 4 of them maintain manufacturing facilities in the continent itself. So this is particularly relevant for policymakers and practitioners in the continent itself. Our findings, it provides the African governments and policymakers with valuable insights into potential partners for public-private collaborations. And also, they can adopt some of the best practices that are showcased in the report and use the report as a way to partner with multinational companies in expanding access. Specifically for policymakers and physicians and clinicians, I think they can use the leverage of the findings to enhance their understanding of the generic and biosimilar medicines access, especially in the context of what they need for their patients itself. It can help them to understand the strategies that are employed, as well as best practices. But I think the most important bit is to also understand here are the forthcoming products that are being made by the industry that they need to use and utilize in their countries. So they need to engage with the industry to make this happen.
That was a conversation on making medicines available to those who need it most. It is now time for us to take a break. Do stay tuned. We'll be back with a conversation on Uganda's economy.